Well, if you're familiar with this channel, you knew that this video was coming after the last video about the law of assumption, Sammy Ingram and Emil Coué, and just repeating something again and again and again. If you're familiar with my stuff, you know that I think that there is more to these manifesting ideas of feeling better and having your external world change than just one particular way of approaching this stuff. There's not one particular way. If there was, there you would see more overall success, following these principles and patterns. There are so many different modalities and approaches that we can take. And so the last couple of videos, when I've been talking about this great Coué quote, which is, make up your mind that you are going to obtain certain results and you will find the ways and means. That is the apparently strange part of it. When I've been talking about that quote, which is a truly great quote, I've been saying this sums up most of these manifesting principles, law of assumption principles, law of attraction principles, whatever you want to call them. Again, I don't think the terminology is that important, what we call it. This sums up most of the general principles and approaches that we hear about when it comes to this stuff. And it's an extremely helpful quote, I think. Extremely helpful. Coué is incredibly illuminating at simplifying these ideas. Better than probably just about anybody I've ever read. But with all that said, it doesn't mean that it's the only approach or that this is 100% true 100% of the time. At all. At all. As much as I love Coué, and Coué is my favorite teacher of these principles by a long shot, and I've learned more from Coué on a practical level than any other LOA teacher, I disagree with him about a bunch of stuff. And I made a video not that long ago that I'll link to, that I would certainly suggest watching if you have questions about this. And, one of the questions you might have is like, well, sometimes I make up my mind and I don't get what I want. Or sometimes I don't make up my mind. I don't have any belief. Like, I don't have the belief it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. And it does happen. It does manifest. And that's the truth of the matter. Things aren't set in stone. But the idea is, figure out different modalities, different approaches using these concepts that tend to work for you or that do work for you, and utilize them. And don't be so dogmatic about it. The dogmatism, saying, oh, this is what works, this does not work, this is a law, is so silly and unnecessary. So I felt compelled to do this follow-up video from the last video, just reminding you of that. I often like to say, like I'm obviously a big fan of these like Coué type principles and approaches, and like law of assumption approaches, I think really come from Coué, But these whole ideas about belief, like the law of belief, believing something is going to happen and then it happens. It's very workable and helpful, but there's a whole other way, as I spoke about in that video that I linked to above, that says you don't have to worry about this belief stuff as much. You can work on this stuff energetically, like the whole letting go process that David Hawkins talks about, releasing, or like working with your emotions, which is what we've been talking about a lot the last couple months. All of that stuff deals much more about how you feel on the inside, right? Without trying to get any specific external results, right? At least not necessarily trying to get any specific external results. And a lot of the time, if you let go, if you stop resisting a fearful feeling and you truly let it be there and then release it, which is a process, and I've done plenty of videos talking about it, and there's plenty of good stuff out there talking about it. But when you do that, what you want, what you might have been trying to manifest for a long time, suddenly might appear in your life, out of nowhere. Again, David Hawkins in Letting Go, he talks about this. And that you have not, at that point, you've not made up your mind that you want something, you're going to obtain it. You've actually let that all go. And I think the larger point here, and as I'll link to another video, one of the best car videos I've ever done about this. The larger point here is that imaginatively, what's going on in our mind and what's going on in our body is so moment to moment and so subtle and nuanced that our so-called belief systems, what we're consciously aware of what we're believing, is not really what's happening. We're not really aware of the depth and the exactitude and the intricacies of what's going on in our mind and our imagination and in our body. By doing these different techniques, we're trying to get more in tune with that, to focus more on what we want, or let go or become at peace with the pain that we might feel in our body. And when we do that, we usually shift things. It's inherent when we do that. That's part of the human experience. If we become more aware of something, we can shift how we feel about it, right? How we think about it, how we imagine about it. But that doesn't mean that there's just one way of doing this. There's so many different ways. And we should really appreciate the different ways of shifting how we feel, of releasing energy, if you want to call it that, right? And whenever we do something like that, you might notice a change in your external world, even if consciously you weren't going for that external change. And one other thing I want to mention in this video is, we were talking about Sammy Ingram yesterday. We've spoken about active affirming, as I like to call it, many times before. And the link between like what Sammy always talks about and what Coué often spoke about, which is that you can only think one thing at a time. You can only think consciously one thing at a time. Now, we have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of thoughts each day. And so if you're spending only 10 or 20 minutes thinking something that you want, even if you're repeating it over and over again, like, I want a new car, I want a new car, or I have a new car, I have a new car. It doesn't matter how you phrase it. It's how it feels right to you when you phrase it, right? It's how it feels, right? So if saying I want a new car feels right, you say that for 20 minutes, you get excited. 20 minutes, you might think, oh, I said that just for 20 minutes straight, to myself or out loud. That's pretty freaking good. And it is pretty freaking good. But guess what? You got another 23 hours and 40 minutes when you weren't saying that to yourself. So there's a very good chance that your imagination, when you're not paying attention, is going to take over and say that you're not getting that new car. But if you persist for 20 minutes each day for long enough, say a couple months, for instance, there's a pretty good chance that that car is going to materialize. That's an example. That's why patience is so important. But when people say, oh, you have to say something 10,000 times or 100,000 times, I get the point of why people say that. And that's to encourage you to just keep on saying it. And you can say it robotically, as people like to say, right? And that's fine. You just keep on saying it. But your imagination, what you're thinking, is constant. You can't stop thinking. This is coming from someone who wrote a book called The Joy of Not Thinking, right? You can't actually stop thinking. It's always happening. And when we do something like repetitive affirmation or autosuggestion, the idea is, because you can only think one thought at a time, you're putting the correct thought that you want in there as opposed to some bullshit thought you don't want in there. And if you do that for long enough, persistently enough, you're sticking that positive thought in enough that even if you have a lot of thoughts that are saying this is, not going to happen, and you don't really believe consciously when you think about it that's going to happen, you've put in enough thoughts saying, you know what, I'm going to get that new car, I'm going to get that new car, or whatever your positive thought may be, that it starts to shift things. Joseph Murphy's got that saying, and I think other people say it too. When you're 51% certain you're going to get what you want, you're going to get what you want, right? It's this idea that once you've turned the tide enough, emotionally, imaginatively, with your 24 hours of thinking, when you think about a subject, if you think about it more positively than negatively most of the time, even if it's only a small majority, it's going to start to turn the tide and in all likelihood manifest in your life in some way. This is also why, circling back to energetically letting go of stuff, we might be thinking about externally manifesting something and then we just give up on it. We say, I'm letting go of this whole thing. And after some work on ourselves, we actually do let go. And what happens is we're just thinking about that external thing that we used to really want totally differently when we've let go than before. all that desperation is gone. And because so much of that energetic desperation is gone and has been replaced with a sense of neutrality and even, dare I say it, peace, that external thing might then show up in our life. You know what I mean? So there's all these different modalities, all these different approaches gunning for the same thing, aiming for the same thing. For his practicality and his succinct psychological explanations, I usually prefer to go to Coué, but I'm very grateful that I'm not dogmatic about it. And I'm not like Coué is the only person to turn to. So many different places to turn when it comes to these ideas. Use what you like and forget the rest. And that, of course, goes for my stuff as much as anyone else's. I hope this was helpful. Any questions? RadicalCounselor.com.